As the night falls and darkness envelops your room, let us journey through the shadows of history, where power corrupted and ambition twisted the souls of men who ruled. These are not tales of heroes or champions, but warnings from the past, stories of kings whose names became synonymous with cruelty, madness, and terror. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that even the mightiest crowns can hide the darkest hearts, and the most opulent thrones can become stages for humanity's greatest horrors. So, close your eyes and let us walk through the corridors of time, where the whispers of victims and the echoes of tyranny still resonate through the centuries. On a cold winter's night, between 1428 and 1431, in the ancient city of Sighisoara in Transylvania, a child was born who would one day become synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. His name was Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracul, but history would remember him by another name, Vlad the Impaler. For a brief moment, he was a hostage prince, a pawn in political games, but soon the boy who learned brutality from his captors would become one of the most feared rulers in Eastern Europe, inspiring nightmares that would endure for centuries. Vlad was born into the noble house of Draculesht, a branch of the House of Basarab, rulers of Wallachia, a region between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River in present-day Romania. As a child, his father's political maneuverings led to young Vlad and his brother Radu being sent as hostages to the Ottoman court. While his brother embraced the Turkish culture, Vlad grew to despise it, harboring a resentment that would later fuel his ruthless campaigns. Within the Ottoman court, young Vlad witnessed public executions and cruel punishments. Instead of breaking his spirit, these displays taught him the power of fear and the language of violence. While other noble hostages grew soft in captivity, Vlad hardened, his mind becoming a forge where strategies of terror were crafted with cold precision. Beneath his compliant exterior grew a burning desire for vengeance, against the Ottomans who held him captive and against the Boyars, Wallachian nobles who had betrayed his father. In 1447, Vlad's father and elder brother were murdered by Wallachian Boyars. This pivotal moment transformed Vlad from a hostage prince to a vengeance-driven claimant to the throne. The betrayal seared itself into his soul, leaving him with an unquenchable thirst for retribution and a belief that mercy was merely weakness disguised as virtue. His path to the throne would be paved with blood, and his rule would be enforced through terror. After years of struggle, Vlad finally secured the Wallachian throne in 1456. His ascension was not marked by celebration, but by calculation. He immediately set about consolidating his power through a reign of terror that would shock even the most hardened medieval sensibilities. He invited hundreds of boyars and their families to a feast, only to have his soldiers surround the hall. Many were impaled outside the palace, while he forced the others to march from the capital to the ruins of his castle at Poenari. Those who survived the arduous trek then labored to rebuild the fortress until they died from exhaustion. What made Vlad truly infamous was his preferred method of execution, impalement. This agonizing death could take hours or even days, as victims were carefully hoisted onto sharpened stakes, the poles positioned to avoid vital organs, prolonging their suffering. Vlad would arrange thousands of impaled victims in concentric circles outside cities or in forest clearings, creating grotesque forests of the impaled to terrify his enemies. During his campaigns against the Ottomans, he created a terrifying Forest of the Impaled, outside the city of Târgoviște, causing the invading Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, to retreat in horror at the sight. Despite facing overwhelming Ottoman forces and treacherous nobles, Vlad defended his realm with fearsome efficiency. When Sultan Mehmed II led a massive invasion force into Wallachia, Vlad employed scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells and using guerrilla warfare. His night attack on the Ottoman camp in 1462 nearly succeeded in assassinating the Sultan himself. Foreign ambassadors and travelers who encountered Vlad described a man of contradictions, cultured and educated, yet capable of dining among his impaled victims, dipping his bread in their blood. Vlad's reign was interrupted by periods of exile and imprisonment. In 1462, he was forced to flee Wallachia when the Ottomans and his own brother Radu mounted an overwhelming campaign against him. After years in Hungarian captivity, he briefly reclaimed his throne in 1476, only to die shortly thereafter in battle. Some accounts claim he was assassinated by his own men, while others suggest he fell fighting the Ottomans. His head was reportedly sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan had it displayed on a stake, a final irony for the master of impalement. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler is complex and enduring. In Romania, he is often viewed as a harsh but just ruler who defended Christianity against Ottoman expansion. His brutal methods have been justified as necessary in desperate times. Yet in Western Europe, his cruelty became legendary, eventually inspiring Bram Stoker's fictional vampire Count Dracula. His atrocities were documented in some of the first printed pamphlets, spreading his reputation across Europe. What makes Vlad's story so compelling and disturbing is not merely the scale of his brutality, but his systematic application of terror as a tool of governance. Unlike rulers who were merely cruel, Vlad elevated cruelty to a principle of statecraft. His methods reveal how quickly the human capacity for violence can be rationalized when in service to power, security, or revenge. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the forests of Wallachia, where mist creeps between ancient trees and shadows deepen with the falling darkness. Somewhere in those woods, the memory of a ruler persists who understood that fear can be more powerful than armies, and that the greatest weapon against enemies is not the sword, but the imaginative application of horror. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that even the most terrifying figures of history were once children with dreams of their own, dreams that somewhere along the path to power became nightmares for everyone around them. On a warm summer day in the year 12 CE, in the coastal town of Antium, a child was born into Rome's most illustrious imperial family. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history would remember him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boot. For a fleeting moment, he was Rome's golden prince, beloved by soldiers and citizens alike who saw in him the promise of a glorious new era. But soon, the charismatic youth who began his reign with generosity and reform would descend into apparent madness and depravity, becoming one of history's most notorious tyrants, whose very name would become synonymous with imperial excess and cruelty. Caligula was born the son of Germanicus, Rome's most celebrated general, and Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Emperor Augustus himself. His childhood was spent among the legions his father commanded along the Rhine frontier, where the soldiers affectionately gave him his nickname after seeing the miniature military boots he wore as he played among their ranks. The troops adored the spirited boy, seeing in him the future of the empire they served. But this idyllic beginning would soon give way to tragedy and darkness that would shape the future emperor's fractured psyche. When Caligula was just 7 years old, his beloved father died suddenly in Syria under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled that Emperor Tiberius, jealous of Germanicus's popularity, had arranged his poisoning. This devastating loss was only the beginning of a childhood marked by trauma and danger. As potential heirs to the throne, Caligula and his family became targets in the deadly game of imperial politics. His mother and 2 older brothers were eventually arrested by Tiberius on charges of treason. All 3 would die in exile or imprisonment, victims of the emperor's paranoia and Rome's ruthless power struggles. By age 18, Caligula was one of the few surviving male members of his family. Summoned to the island of Capri, where Emperor Tiberius had retreated from public life, the young prince spent 6 years in what amounted to a gilded captivity. On this isolated island retreat, Tiberius, now elderly, bitter, and increasingly depraved, exposed his young heir to the darkest aspects of absolute power. Caligula learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of compliance, watching carefully and waiting for his moment to come. These formative years taught Caligula crucial lessons about imperial power and perhaps planted seeds of the behavior that would later emerge. In 37 CE, when Caligula was 24, Tiberius died, and with the support of the Praetorian Guard commander Macro, Caligula was proclaimed emperor, despite Tiberius's will, which had named both him and his cousin Gemellus as joint heirs. The Senate and people of Rome greeted his accession with jubilation, exhausted by Tiberius's grim, reclusive rule, and hopeful that Augustus's great-grandson would usher in a new golden age for the empire. The young emperor's first actions seemed to confirm these hopes and highlighted the stark contrast with his predecessor. The first 6 months of Caligula's reign were marked by generosity and wise governance. He declared an amnesty for political prisoners, recalled those who had been exiled, and ended the treason trials that had terrorized Rome's elite under Tiberius. He staged lavish gladiatorial games and chariot races for the public, distributed generous bonuses to the military, and abolished unpopular taxes. He completed public works projects that benefited ordinary citizens and showed respect to the Senate. Contemporaries described how Caligula was initially admired throughout the Roman world, from east to west, suggesting a ruler of exceptional promise. But in October of 37 CE, during his first year as emperor, a transformative event occurred that would forever alter the course of Caligula's reign. The young emperor fell gravely ill with what ancient sources describe as a brain fever. For nearly a month, he lingered between life and death as Rome held its breath. Modern historians have speculated about the nature of this illness. Was it encephalitis, epilepsy, or perhaps poisoning that damaged his brain? Whatever the cause, when Caligula recovered, contemporaries noted a marked change in his behavior. The benevolent young ruler was gone, and in his place stood an increasingly erratic, paranoid, and cruel emperor who would terrorize Rome for the next 3.5 years. What defined the post-illness Caligula was his growing megalomaniacal behavior. Moving beyond the conventional notion that emperors might become gods after death, Caligula began to insist he was a living deity who should be worshipped accordingly. He had the heads removed from statues of Greek and Roman gods and replaced with his own likeness. He appointed himself a priest of his own cult and built a temple to his divinity. His prized horse, Incitatus, received an extraordinary level of luxury, with tales of marble stalls and plans for political appointment that symbolized the emperor's contempt for Roman institutions. When a delegation of Jewish leaders from Alexandria refused to place his statue in their synagogues, he threatened to erect an image of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem, risking widespread revolt in Judea. This divine self-conception freed Caligula from normal human constraints. Historical accounts, though potentially exaggerated by hostile sources, suggest he began to indulge in behavior that shocked even the Romans, who were accustomed to imperial excess. He allegedly established a brothel in a wing of the imperial palace, forcing noble women to serve there. His relationships with his three sisters, particularly Drusilla, were rumored to be incestuous, and when she died in 38 CE, he had her deified. He delighted in humiliating the Senate, forcing distinguished members to run alongside his chariot or wait on him at banquets. His cruelty became legendary. He reportedly forced parents to attend the executions of their children and used torture as entertainment during his meals. Caligula's financial excesses matched his personal behavior. He quickly depleted the treasury surplus that Tiberius had accumulated through decades of frugality. To replenish his coffers, he established new taxes, confiscated estates of wealthy citizens accused of treason, and devised increasingly creative methods of raising funds. His construction projects were ambitious and often impractical, including a floating bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae, which he rode across on horseback supposedly to disprove a prophecy. His building program extended from practical projects like aqueducts to grandiose monuments to his own glory, straining the imperial treasury to its limits. As his reign progressed, Caligula's paranoia deepened. He executed or forced to suicide anyone he perceived as a threat, including his cousin and co-heir Gemellus, his father-in-law, and even the Praetorian commander Macro, who had helped him secure the throne. Ancient sources describe increasing signs of mental instability, insomnia, moodiness, and unpredictable behavior that made him feared by all, as no one could predict what might trigger his displeasure. While some modern historians question the reliability of these accounts, the pattern of erratic governance and purges against perceived enemies is well established. By January of 41 CE, after less than 4 years on the throne, Rome had reached its breaking point. The Praetorian Guard, led by Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated, conspired with several senators to assassinate the emperor. On January 24th, as Caligula was leaving an entertainment in the imperial palace and walking through an underground passage, the conspirators struck. The emperor was stabbed repeatedly, sources suggest as many as 30 times, and died on the spot. His wife Caesonia and their infant daughter were also murdered to extinguish his bloodline. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, but the Praetorians found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding in the palace and proclaimed him the new emperor. After Caligula's death, the Senate attempted to condemn his memory, ordering his statues destroyed and his name erased from public monuments. Yet his infamy only grew over time. Roman historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio portrayed him as the embodiment of imperial tyranny, a cautionary tale of unchecked power corrupting absolutely. Modern scholars debate the reliability of these accounts, noting the biases of aristocratic historians against an emperor who had humiliated their class. Some argue that Caligula's madness may have been exaggerated or misunderstood, while others see evidence of genuine mental illness, possibly triggered by his near-death experience. What makes Caligula's story so compelling is the stark contrast between his promising beginning and his monstrous end. Unlike rulers who were cruel from the start, Caligula's transformation suggests the corrupting influence of absolute power combined with possible neurological damage. His reign raises uncomfortable questions about human nature. How quickly can someone shift from benevolent ruler to tyrant? What happens when there are no checks on authority? And how does a society recover from the trauma of living under such arbitrary cruelty? Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine ancient Rome at the height of its splendor. Marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, crowds cheering in the Circus Maximus, the might of the legions ensuring peace within vast borders. Then picture a young man barely into adulthood, suddenly given control over this immense empire with no constraints on his worst impulses. Consider how quickly the dream of a new golden age transformed into a waking nightmare for those who lived under Caligula's increasingly erratic rule. So, sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that power without accountability corrupts even the most promising souls, and that the line between sanity and madness may be thinner than we like to believe, especially for those who hear only yes from those around them. On a chilly winter's day in December of 37 CE, in the seaside town of Antium, a child was born into a noble Roman family. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but history would remember him by another name: Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the fifth emperor of Rome. For a fleeting moment, he was hailed as a promising young ruler who brought generous reforms and artistic sensibility to the empire. But soon, the idealistic youth who once banned capital punishment would descend into paranoia and narcissism, becoming one of history's most notorious tyrants whose name would forever be associated with decadence, cruelty, and the apocryphal tale of playing music while his capital burned. Nero was born into the prestigious Domiti Ahenobarbi family, with blood connections to Rome's first emperor, Augustus, through his mother Agrippina the Younger. His early childhood, however, was marked by danger and uncertainty. When he was just 3 years old, his father died, leaving him under his mother's care. This proved precarious when Agrippina was exiled by Emperor Caligula, forcing young Nero to be raised by his aunt. Fortune's wheel turned when Caligula was assassinated and succeeded by Claudius, who recalled Agrippina from exile. The ambitious Agrippina soon seduced and married her own uncle Claudius, becoming empress and positioning her son for greatness. In a calculated move, Agrippina persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his son in 50 CE, placing him ahead of Claudius's own son, Britannicus, in the line of succession. Nero was tutored by the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, who cultivated in him an appreciation for Greek culture, philosophy, and the arts, passions that would later define his reign, for better and worse. To cement his position, the teenage Nero was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, binding him even more closely to the imperial family and setting the stage for his rise to power. The pivotal moment in Nero's life came in October of 54 CE, when Emperor Claudius died after consuming a plate of mushrooms. Ancient sources strongly suggest that Agrippina had poisoned her husband to secure the throne for her son before Britannicus could come of age. With the support of the Praetorian Guard and his mother's machinations, the 17-year-old Nero ascended to the throne, becoming the youngest sole emperor Rome had yet seen. The transition was remarkably smooth, with the Senate and people welcoming the handsome young emperor who promised a return to the enlightened principles of Augustus. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, often called the Quinquennium Neronis, were marked by wise governance and moderation. Guided by Seneca and Burrus, Nero reduced taxes, gave more authority to the Senate, ended secret trials, and banned capital punishment. He provided assistance to cities that had suffered disasters and improved relations with the Senate, which had been strained under previous emperors. He sponsored poetry competitions, theatrical performances, and athletic events as alternatives to bloody gladiatorial combat. In these early years, Nero embodied the ideal of the enlightened ruler, earning praise from contemporaries for his clemency and generosity. But beneath this promising facade lurked a power struggle between the young emperor and his domineering mother. Agrippina had expected to rule through her son and grew increasingly frustrated as Nero sought independence. The breaking point came when Nero began an affair with a former slave named Acte against his mother's wishes. When Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus as the rightful emperor, the young prince died suddenly at a dinner party, almost certainly poisoned at Nero's command. This first murder marked the beginning of Nero's moral decline, a decisive step on the path that would lead to greater atrocities. By 59 CE, Nero could no longer tolerate his mother's interference. After multiple failed attempts to kill her discreetly, including an elaborate collapsible boat designed to drown her, Nero finally dispatched a group of naval officers to her villa on the Bay of Naples. There, they brutally murdered the woman who had secured him the throne, stabbing her repeatedly while she allegedly cried out, "Strike my womb," pointing to the part of her body that had given birth to such a monstrous son. With Agrippina's death, the last restraining influence on Nero's behavior was removed. Seneca and Burrus continued to advise moderation, but their influence waned as the emperor indulged his darkest impulses. Now unbound by maternal oversight, Nero began to pursue his artistic passions with inappropriate zeal for a Roman emperor. He trained as a singer, lyre player, actor, and charioteer, professions considered deeply undignified for a Roman nobleman, let alone an emperor. He compelled senators and nobles to watch his performances, which sometimes lasted for hours, and established the Neronia, a Greek-style festival of music, gymnastics, and horse racing. No one was permitted to leave during his performances on pain of death, and witnesses reported women giving birth during his recitals and men faking death to escape the tedium. Far from the dignified princeps Augustus had established, Nero fashioned himself as an artist emperor whose creative pursuits took precedence over effective governance. In 64 CE, disaster struck Rome in the form of a great fire that raged for 9 days, destroying 3 of the city's 14 districts and severely damaging 7 others. Contrary to popular legend, Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. The violin wouldn't be invented for over a millennium, and Nero was actually in Antium when the fire began. Upon hearing the news, he rushed back to the capital, opened his gardens to the homeless, and implemented new building regulations requiring wider streets and fire-resistant materials. However, rumors soon spread that Nero had started the fire himself to clear land for his massive new palace, the Domus Aurea, Golden House. To deflect blame, Nero accused the Christians, then an obscure religious sect, of arson. This led to the first imperial persecution of Christians, who were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena, or smeared with pitch and burned as human torches in Nero's gardens while he rode among them in his chariot. Whether or not Nero truly believed the Christians responsible, his brutal treatment of them earned him lasting infamy. Meanwhile, construction of the Domus Aurea proceeded, a vast complex spanning 100 to 300 acres in the heart of Rome, featuring a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero, artificial lakes, and dining rooms with ceilings that showered guests with flower petals and perfume, all while Romans struggled to rebuild their homes. As Nero's reign progressed, his paranoia and cruelty intensified. In 65 CE, he discovered the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot by senators and equestrians to assassinate him and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Nero's response was swift and merciless. Dozens were executed or forced to commit suicide, including the poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, Nero's former tutor, and numerous senators. That same year, Nero kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea Sabina to death in a fit of rage. The same woman for whom he had divorced and executed his first wife Octavia. His reign of terror expanded, with anyone who possessed too much wealth or showed too much talent becoming a target for imperial jealousy. By 67 CE, even Rome's seemingly boundless patience for imperial excess was wearing thin. Nero's financial extravagance had drained the treasury and led to debasement of the currency. His neglect of military affairs resulted in a series of revolts in Gaul, Britain, and Judea. His persecution of senators and confiscation of property alienated the elite. His scandalous behavior, including a public marriage to a male slave named Sporus, who resembled his deceased wife Poppaea, outraged traditional Romans. His obsession with Greek culture over Roman values struck many as unpatriotic. As resentment grew, Nero became increasingly unstable, possibly suffering from the psychological effects of absolute power combined with the fear of retribution. The end came in 68 CE, when Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rebelled against Nero's tax policies. Though the rebellion was quickly crushed, it inspired others. Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself legate of the Senate and Roman people rather than of the emperor. The Praetorian Guard, once Nero's staunch supporters, were persuaded by their prefect Nymphidius Sabinus to abandon the emperor in exchange for a generous financial reward. As his support crumbled, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, sentencing him to death in the ancient manner, stripped naked, head thrust into a wooden fork, and flogged to death. Faced with this humiliating fate, Nero fled Rome with a few loyal freedmen. In a villa outside the city, he prepared for suicide, famously lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." Hearing the approach of horsemen and lacking the courage to kill himself, he persuaded his secretary Epaphroditos to help him drive a dagger into his throat. As he died on June 9, 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus expired with him. His death triggered a period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as rival claimants fought for the throne. After his death, Nero's memory was condemned by the Senate in a process called damnatio memoriae. His statues were destroyed, his name erased from public monuments, and his policies reversed in an attempt to expunge him from history. Yet the common people, who had often benefited from his populist policies and lavish games, reportedly mourned him. Flowers appeared mysteriously on his tomb, and at least 3 false Neros emerged in the eastern provinces in subsequent decades, finding significant support among those who either missed his rule or refused to believe he was truly dead. What makes Nero's story so compelling is its representation of absolute power's corrosive effect on human character. Unlike rulers who began as tyrants, Nero's descent from promising prince to paranoid despot illustrates how unchecked authority can warp even those with initially benevolent intentions. His reign also demonstrates the tension between personal freedom and public responsibility. Nero's desire to be an artist first and emperor second neglected the needs of the state and ultimately led to his downfall. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine ancient Rome in its imperial splendor, the gleaming marble temples, the crowded forums, the majestic Palatine Hill where emperors dwelled. Picture a young man with artistic dreams and unlimited power, torn between the stern Roman virtues of his ancestors and the seductive call of personal pleasure and artistic expression. Consider how the orphaned boy who once showed such promise became the tyrant who killed his mother, persecuted an obscure religious sect, and built a golden palace while his people struggled to rebuild their homes. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that even the most talented and privileged among us need the guidance of wise counsel and the restraint of moral boundaries, for without these, the freedom to do anything we desire may become the prison of our worst impulses. On a cold winter's day in December of 1166, within the stone walls of Beaumont Palace in Oxford, a child was born into the powerful Plantagenet dynasty of England. His name was John, the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. For a fleeting moment, he was merely John Lackland, a prince without inheritance, overshadowed by his warrior brothers. But soon, the overlooked prince would ascend to the throne, becoming one of England's most reviled monarchs, a king whose incompetence, cruelty, and treachery would cost him his empire, nearly lose his crown, and ironically set England on the path toward constitutional government. John was born into a family dynasty that ruled a vast empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees Mountains in southern France. As the youngest of Henry II's legitimate sons, he wasn't expected to inherit significant lands or power, earning him the mocking nickname Lackland. While his elder brothers, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, were groomed for leadership and territorial rule, John grew up largely ignored by his father until his older siblings rebelled against the king in 1173. When John remained loyal, he became his father's favorite, though this did little to secure his position in the succession. The young prince developed into a complex individual, intelligent and capable of administrative efficiency, yet possessed of severe character flaws that would prove his undoing. Unlike his martial brother Richard, John preferred intrigue to open warfare. He was well educated but lacked the chivalric virtues prized in medieval kings. As he matured, John became known for his mercurial temper, vindictiveness, and propensity for cruelty toward those who displeased him. He developed a reputation for lechery, reportedly seducing the wives and daughters of his barons, and for greed that knew few bounds. These traits might have been overlooked in a successful king, but John would prove anything but. The pivotal moment in John's rise to power came when his brother Richard the Lionheart, having succeeded their father as king, departed on the Third Crusade in 1190. John immediately began plotting to seize power, allying with King Philip II of France against his absent brother. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his return journey, John actively worked to prevent his release. Yet when Richard returned to England in 1194, he surprisingly forgave his treacherous brother. This unearned mercy taught John nothing about magnanimity. Instead, it reinforced his belief that betrayal carried no lasting consequences, a lesson he would apply repeatedly during his own reign. In 1199, when Richard died from an arrow wound sustained during a minor siege, John moved swiftly to secure the throne. His claim was complicated by the existence of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, the son of his deceased elder brother Geoffrey, who had a stronger legal claim. The inheritance of the crown was not yet firmly fixed on principles of primogeniture, however, and John successfully outmaneuvered Arthur to be crowned King of England in May 1199. He also inherited Richard's vast continental territories, including Normandy and Aquitaine. Despite a troubled beginning, John's early reign showed promise. He negotiated peace with Scotland and France and demonstrated the administrative competence that would remain one of his few positive qualities throughout his disastrous rule. What defined John's reign, or more accurately, what destroyed it, was his catastrophic loss of the French territories that had been the foundation of Plantagenet power since his father's time. The trouble began when John, having set aside his first wife Isabel of Gloucester, married Isabella of Angoulême in 1200. This beautiful young woman was already betrothed to one of his vassals, Hugh de Lusignan, and the marriage created a dangerous enemy. When the outraged Lusignans appealed to Philip II of France, John refused to appear at Philip's court to answer charges, as feudal custom required. Philip seized on this pretext to declare John's French fiefs forfeit and to recognize Arthur of Brittany's claim to them. The ensuing war went disastrously for John. Though he briefly captured Arthur in 1202, the young man's subsequent disappearance, almost certainly at John's own hands, horrified medieval sensibilities and turned French opinion decisively against him. By 1204, Philip had conquered Normandy, severing the Anglo-Norman realm that had existed since 1066. Within a few years, Anjou, Maine, and much of Poitou followed, leaving Gascony as John's only significant continental holding. The loss of Normandy was a devastating blow to John's prestige and eliminated lands that provided much of the crown's income. Moreover, many Anglo-Norman barons now faced an impossible choice between their English and Norman estates, a dilemma that would erode John's support among the nobility. His response to these disasters revealed the worst of John's character. Desperate to reclaim his lost territories, he imposed crushing taxation on England, particularly targeting the Jewish community and the church. He enforced obsolete feudal obligations, arbitrarily fined barons who displeased him, and seized the lands of those who opposed his policies. When Pope Innocent III appointed Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury against John's wishes, the king confiscated church properties, leading to his excommunication in 1209 and an interdict that suspended religious services throughout England. Only when he needed the Pope's support against his barons did John submit, making England a papal fief in 1213. A humiliating concession that further angered the nobility. John's cruelty knew few limits. Contemporary chronicles describe him walling up the wife and son of an enemy to starve to death, extracting teeth from Jews until they paid impossible ransoms, and executing hostages taken from noble families. He kept meticulous records of his extortions, showing a cold efficiency in his oppression. Stories circulated of his lascivious behavior toward the wives and daughters of his barons, some of whom he allegedly violated while their male relatives were hostages at his court. Even by medieval standards, when harsh rule was expected, John's combination of avarice, vindictiveness, and unpredictability violated the implicit covenant between king and subject. In 1214, John made a final attempt to recover his French territories, forming a coalition with Emperor Otto IV of Germany and the Count of Flanders against Philip II. The campaign ended in a crushing defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, where Philip's forces routed John's allies. When the king returned to England, broken and humiliated, he found his barons in open rebellion. Years of financial extortion, arbitrary justice, and personal slights had finally pushed the nobility beyond endurance. Led by Robert Fitzwalter, they renounced their feudal ties to John and marched on London, capturing the capital and forcing the king to negotiate. The culmination of this baronial revolt came at Runnymede in June 1215, where John met with the rebel leaders. Archbishop Langton mediated peace talks that produced a Charter of Liberties aimed at limiting royal power and protecting baronial rights. This document, which would later be known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was sealed by King John on June 15, 1215. Though primarily concerned with feudal relationships rather than abstract principles of liberty, Magna Carta established the revolutionary concept that the king was subject to the law, not above it. Its most famous clauses guaranteed that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land, and that to no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. John had no intention of honouring the charter, however. He had submitted to it under duress, and within weeks had secured from Pope Innocent III an annulment of his oath, on the grounds that it had been extracted by force. The barons, realizing that John could not be trusted, renewed their rebellion and invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. By autumn, England had descended into full-scale civil war, with John leading mercenary forces on brutal campaigns across his own kingdom. He burned towns, ravaged the countryside, and seized the properties of all who opposed him, driving even formerly loyal subjects into the rebel camp. As the war turned against him, John made a fateful decision to cross the Wash, a marshy estuary in eastern England, during high tide in October 1216. In a scene that seems orchestrated by poetic justice, his baggage train was caught by the incoming sea and swept away, carrying with it the crown jewels and much of the royal treasury. Already suffering from dysentery, John retreated to Newark Castle, where his condition worsened. On the night of October 18th to 19th, 1216, he died in agony, his body ravaged by disease and his kingdom torn apart by the civil war he had precipitated. His 9-year-old son, Henry, was proclaimed king, and the rebel barons, preferring a child they could influence to a French prince, gradually returned to loyalty. John's legacy is paradoxical. Universally regarded as a failure in his own time, his very awfulness produced one of the most important developments in Western political history: the concept that a monarch's power should be constrained by law. Magna Carta, though not initially intended as a constitutional document, established principles that would evolve into key concepts of due process, consent to taxation, and the rule of law. The Charter was reissued multiple times after John's death, becoming a fundamental part of English legal tradition and eventually influencing constitutional development around the world, including the founding documents of the United States. What makes John's story so compelling is how his catastrophic reign inadvertently advanced human liberty. Unlike tyrants who merely caused suffering, John's particular combination of untrustworthiness, avarice and incompetence forced his barons to articulate principles of limited government that would reverberate through the centuries. His failure as a king became a crucial step in the long journey toward constitutional governance, a journey that continues to this day in nations around the world. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the rain-soaked meadow of Runnymede, where a reluctant king placed his seal on a document he had no intention of honoring, yet which would echo through history as a cornerstone of liberty. Picture a monarch whose losses, of empire, of reputation, even of crown jewels, would ultimately contribute more to political progress than the victories of more admired rulers. Consider the irony that one of history's worst kings inadvertently planted seeds that would bloom into protections against the very abuses of power he embodied. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that history often works through unexpected channels, and that even the worst rulers can, through the resistance they provoke, inadvertently serve the cause of human freedom. On a bright spring day in April of 1835, in the opulent royal palace of Brussels, a child was born into one of Europe's youngest and smallest royal families. His name was Leopold, son of the first king of the newly formed nation of Belgium. For a fleeting moment, he was merely a second son in a minor European monarchy, limited by constitutional constraints and governing a country barely 5 years old. But soon, the ambitious prince would carve out a personal empire in the heart of Africa, transforming himself from a constrained European monarch into the sole owner of a territory 76 times larger than Belgium. There, he would establish a regime of systematic terror and exploitation, becoming one of history's most ruthless rulers, a king whose pursuit of wealth would lead to the deaths of millions in a forgotten Holocaust that foreshadowed the darkest atrocities of the 20th century. Leopold was born into privilege, but not great power. Belgium itself was a young nation, created in 1830 when it separated from the Netherlands. The Belgian monarchy had limited authority at home, constrained by a constitution that made the king little more than a figurehead. Young Leopold grew up watching his father navigate these limitations with frustration, instilling in him a desire for greater power and recognition on the world stage. From an early age, he displayed an acute intelligence and ambition that went far beyond the borders of his small kingdom. As he matured, Leopold developed into a paradoxical figure, intellectually brilliant but emotionally cold, articulate in multiple languages, yet unable to connect with those around him. He married Marie Henriette of Austria in a loveless union that produced 4 children, but he maintained numerous affairs and treated his wife with indifference. Leopold's true passion was not for people, but for empire building. As a young man, he obsessively studied colonial ventures of other European powers, particularly the Dutch East Indies, which generated enormous wealth through forced cultivation systems. When he became King of Belgium in 1865, following his father's death, he immediately began looking for overseas territories to exploit. He first considered areas in Asia and South America before turning his attention to Africa. Unlike other European rulers of his era, Leopold didn't merely want colonies for his nation. He wanted a personal empire that would bypass Belgium's constitutional constraints and be answerable only to himself. The pivotal moment in Leopold's imperial ambitions came in the late 1870s, when he learned of the vast unexplored territory in the Congo Basin of Central Africa. To pursue this prize, Leopold adopted a strategy of breathtaking duplicity. In 1876, he convened the Brussels Geographic Conference, presenting himself to the world as a philanthropist interested in bringing civilization to Africa. He created the International African Association, ostensibly a scientific and humanitarian organization, to mask his true intentions. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to establish trading stations along the Congo River and make treaties with local chiefs. While other European powers were distracted by more obvious colonial prizes, Leopold focused on the Congo Basin, a region rich in ivory, rubber, and other valuable resources. Through complex diplomatic maneuvering, playing European powers against each other while presenting himself as a disinterested philanthropist, Leopold achieved a stunning diplomatic coup. Then at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, he persuaded the major powers of Europe and the United States to recognize his claim to the Congo Basin as his personal property. The territory would be called the Congo Free State, though it was neither free nor a proper state. It was Leopold's private domain, a territory of approximately 1 million square miles, about the size of Western Europe, with a population of perhaps 20 million people. It was an unprecedented arrangement in modern history, a private individual owning an entire country. With international recognition secured, Leopold's true nature was revealed. The humanitarian mask dropped to expose the face of unrestrained greed. Leopold never visited the Congo himself, ruling from Brussels through a series of administrators whose advancement depended on extracting maximum profits. Initially, the focus was on ivory, but as the rubber boom began in the 1890s with the development of pneumatic tires and growing demand for rubber in industrial production, Leopold's attention turned to exploiting the rubber vines that grew wild throughout the Congolese rainforest. What made Leopold's Congo uniquely horrific was the systematic cruelty employed to maximize production. The king established a regime of forced labor throughout his domain. Villages were assigned rubber collection quotas, with the force publique, a brutal army of European officers and African conscripts, enforcing these demands through terror. If a village failed to meet its quota, the force publique would raid it, taking women and children hostage until the men brought in the required rubber. These hostages were often starved, raped, or worked to death. Those who resisted were killed, their villages burned. The system of terror was designed and implemented with cold efficiency, transforming an entire territory into what amounted to a massive slave labor camp. The most notorious practice in Leopold's Congo was the severing of hands. Force publique soldiers were required to account for every bullet they used by bringing back a severed right hand from those they killed. This led to soldiers often shooting people simply to obtain hands, which became a kind of currency. When villages failed to meet their rubber quotas, hands would be cut off as punishment, not just from men, but from women and children as well. Sometimes the victims survived the amputation, left to live with their mutilation as a warning to others. Baskets of severed hands would be presented to European officers as proof of punishment carried out, with photographs of these grisly trophies eventually reaching Europe and shocking the public conscience. The human toll was catastrophic. While precise figures are impossible to determine, conservative estimates suggest that the population of the Congo declined by 10 million people, approximately half the pre-colonial population, during Leopold's ownership from 1885 to 1908. This depopulation resulted from a lethal combination of killings, starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Entire communities disappeared as people fled into the forest to escape rubber collection, only to die of exposure or hunger. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned or wiped out entirely. Birth rates plummeted as families were torn apart, women taken hostage, and the social fabric destroyed. It was not merely brutal colonialism, it was industrial-scale exploitation that treated human beings as expendable resources in the pursuit of profit. For years, the horrors of the Congo remained hidden from international view. Leopold controlled information tightly, presenting his enterprise as a humanitarian and civilizing mission. Journalists were rarely allowed into the Congo Free State, and those who were permitted entry saw only what Leopold's administrators wanted them to see. The king spent lavishly from his Congo profits on public works and monuments in Belgium, cultivating an image as a great philanthropist and builder. He constructed the magnificent Royal Museum for Central Africa near Brussels, filled with Congolese artifacts, but containing no mention of the atrocities being committed to obtain them. Leopold employed writers and publicists to enhance his reputation, and for many years, Europeans and Americans believed the fiction that he was bringing civilization and progress to what they considered a dark continent. However, cracks in this facade began to appear as missionaries, steamboat captains, and a few courageous officials began to speak out about what they had witnessed. In 1890, a black American missionary named George Washington Williams became one of the first to publicly denounce Leopold's regime, using the phrase "crimes against humanity" to describe what he had seen. African-American missionary William Shepherd documented atrocities in the Kasai region. But the turning point came when a British shipping clerk named Edmund Dean Morel noticed that ships arriving in Belgium from the Congo were laden with valuable rubber and ivory, while ships heading to the Congo carried only weapons and ammunition, not the trade goods that would be expected in legitimate commerce. Morel realized this could only mean one thing: forced labor on a massive scale. Morel quit his job and dedicated himself to exposing Leopold's crimes. He founded the Congo Reform Association and enlisted allies, including the famous novelist Joseph Conrad, whose novella Heart of Darkness was inspired by his experiences in the Congo, and Sir Roger Casement, a British diplomat who documented atrocities in an official report. Crucially, the reformers gathered photographic evidence of mutilated Congolese victims, using the relatively new technology of photography to create what became one of the first international human rights campaigns. Famous writers like Mark Twain joined the cause, with Twain publishing a scathing satirical pamphlet titled King Leopold's Soliloquy. As evidence mounted and public pressure grew in Britain, the United States, and eventually Belgium itself, Leopold's position became untenable. Faced with mounting international pressure and irrefutable evidence of atrocities, the Belgian government finally annexed the Congo in 1908, ending Leopold's personal rule. The king, however, emerged virtually unscathed. Before surrendering control, he burned most of the colony's archives, destroying evidence of his crimes. He received a substantial financial compensation from the Belgian government and continued to live in luxury until his death in 1909. His funeral procession in Brussels was booed by the Belgian public, a rare moment of accountability for a man who had otherwise escaped justice for his actions in Africa. Leopold's legacy in the Congo cast a long shadow. Even after the territory became a Belgian colony, many of the exploitative systems he established continued to operate, albeit with somewhat less brutality. The scars of his regime, physical, psychological, and social, persisted for generations. The Belgian Congo would not gain independence until 1960, becoming what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a nation still struggling with the legacy of colonial exploitation and the resource curse that has made its mineral wealth a source of conflict rather than prosperity. What makes Leopold's story particularly disturbing is the disconnect between his European and African personas. In Belgium, he was known as the Builder King, responsible for magnificent public works and urban improvements. He constructed grand boulevards, museums, and public parks that beautified Brussels, all paid for with wealth extracted through terror in the Congo. This duality, civilized monarch in Europe, ruthless exploiter in Africa, exemplifies the hypocrisy of the colonial era and the willingness of European societies to ignore atrocities committed beyond their shores. Leopold's rule also demonstrates the dangers of conflating state and private interests. Unlike other colonial regimes, which at least operated under some governmental constraints and public scrutiny, Leopold's Congo was his personal fiefdom, where profit maximization was the only consideration. It represents perhaps the most extreme example of how the pursuit of wealth, absent any countervailing force of law or morality, can lead to industrial-scale human suffering. The international system that allowed one man to own an entire country, treating its inhabitants as his personal property, reveals the moral blindness at the heart of the colonial enterprise. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the lush rainforests of Central Africa, where the rubber vines grow thick and the mighty Congo River winds through green valleys. Then picture the terror that came with the sound of approaching boots, the desperate flight of villagers into forests that offered no protection, the severed hands collected in baskets as proof of discipline maintained. Remember a time when one man's greed transformed a region larger than Western Europe into a private labor camp, and how the world looked away for decades while millions perished in a holocaust of exploitation. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and consider how easily humanity can be blinded to suffering when it occurs far from view, and how vigilance against such blindness remains as necessary today as it was when Leopold turned the heart of Africa into a hell on earth for the sake of profit. On the windswept steppes of Central Asia, sometime around 406 CE, a child was born into the nomadic warrior culture of the Huns. His name was Attila, son of Mundzuk, a name that would one day make emperors tremble. For a fleeting moment, he was merely a prince among the horse lords, learning the arts of archery and horsemanship on the endless grasslands. But soon, the skilled warrior would unite the Hun tribes and lead them on a campaign of terror that would earn him the title Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, a conqueror whose very name would become synonymous with ruthless destruction. Attila was born into the ruling clan of the Huns, a nomadic people whose origins likely lay in the regions of modern Mongolia and northern China. The Huns were master horsemen, capable of shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Their mobility, ferocity, and seemingly alien customs had already begun to terrify the settled peoples of Europe. Young Attila grew up in this culture of warfare and conquest, where valor in battle determined a man's worth, and the weak were shown no mercy. But unlike the stereotype of the unwashed, uneducated barbarian, Attila received an education befitting his noble birth. He learned to speak both Gothic and Latin, the languages of Rome's empire and its neighbors, and studied the diplomatic and military tactics that would later serve him well. From childhood, Attila was schooled in the harsh disciplines of nomadic life. riding before he could walk, shooting a bow from horseback, enduring extreme conditions without complaint. As a member of the ruling family, he was present when his uncles, Oktar and Rugila, who jointly ruled the Hunnic Empire in the early 5th century, received Roman ambassadors. These early experiences taught him the value of both military strength and diplomatic cunning. Another formative influence in Attila's youth was his relationship with Aetius, a Roman who had spent time as a hostage among the Huns and would later become the supreme commander of Roman forces in the West. The two grew up together, learning each other's languages and tactics, a connection that would play a crucial role in their later confrontations. The pivotal moment in Attila's rise to power came in 434 CE, when his uncles died and he inherited joint control of the Hunnic Empire alongside his older brother, Bleda. The brothers' first action was to negotiate a treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire, using the threat of their formidable cavalry to extract an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold. But this partnership between siblings was not destined to last. For reasons that remain unclear but likely involved a struggle for sole power, Attila had his brother murdered in 445 CE. With Bleda gone, Attila became the undisputed ruler of the Huns, concentrating all authority in his hands and embarking on a series of campaigns that would terrorize both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Now in sole command, Attila transformed the loose confederation of Hunnic tribes into a disciplined military force that would shake the foundations of the civilized world. He imposed strict discipline on his warriors, organized them into effective units, and built a complex intelligence network through spies and informants. Unlike many barbarian leaders before him, Attila understood the power of psychological warfare. He deliberately cultivated his image as a figure of supernatural terror, encouraging rumors of his invincibility and divine mandate for destruction. Roman writers would later describe him as having a squat body, a large head with small, deep-set eyes, a flat nose and a thin beard, with a gaze so fierce it made men tremble, though this description may owe more to fear than reality. In 447 CE, Attila launched a devastating campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire, sweeping through the Balkans with unprecedented ferocity. His horsemen destroyed over 70 cities, leaving trails of devastation from the Black Sea to the Aegean. No Roman army could stand against his mounted archers, whose tactics of lightning strikes and feigned retreats baffled the traditional Roman infantry. When the Emperor Theodosius II attempted to have Attila assassinated, the plot was discovered. In the negotiations that followed, Attila forced the Romans to pay an indemnity of 6,000 pounds of gold and an annual tribute of 2,100 pounds. The once mighty Eastern Empire was reduced to paying protection money, its fields laid waste, and its treasuries drained. What made Attila truly terrifying was not merely his military prowess, but his calculated use of psychological warfare. He deliberately cultivated his image as an instrument of divine wrath, encouraging rumors about his supernatural origins and powers. He would sometimes spare a single city while destroying all others in a region, ensuring that tales of Hunnic savagery would spread. The fear preceding his armies often defeated his enemies before a single arrow was loosed. He understood that terror itself was a weapon, and he wielded it with consummate skill. Villages would be abandoned at the mere rumor of his approach, their inhabitants fleeing into forests or mountains rather than face the legendary cruelty of the Huns. Despite his fearsome reputation, Attila was a more complex leader than the simple barbarian of Roman propaganda. When the diplomat Priscus visited his headquarters on the Hungarian plain in 449 CE, he found not a crude camp, but a sprawling settlement with wooden palaces. Attila himself lived relatively simply compared to his chieftains. While they dined off silver plates, he ate meat from a wooden platter. While they adorned themselves with gold and jewels, he wore plain, clean clothing. He listened carefully to disputes among his subjects and rendered fair judgments. This combination of simplicity, justice toward his own people, and strategic brutality toward enemies made him a leader his warriors would follow to the ends of the earth. By 450 CE, Attila had turned his attention to the Western Roman Empire. A bizarre twist of fate provided his pretext for invasion when Honoria, the sister of Emperor Valentinian III, sent Attila her ring and a plea for help to escape an unwanted marriage. Attila chose to interpret this as a proposal, demanding half the Western Empire as her dowry. When refused, he assembled an enormous army, perhaps 200,000 strong, and invaded Gaul, modern France, in 451 CE. City after city fell before him. Metz was burned to the ground, its inhabitants massacred. Reims, Paris, and Orleans were threatened. The Western Romans, led by Attila's childhood acquaintance Aetius, formed an alliance with the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes to counter this existential threat. The two forces met in the decisive Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of history's most consequential engagements. For the first time, Attila faced an alliance capable of matching his numbers and tactics. After a day of brutal combat that left tens of thousands dead on both sides, the Hunnic forces were checked, though not destroyed. The Visigothic king Theodoric was killed, but the combined Roman-Germanic army held its ground. Attila withdrew in good order, the first significant setback in his career of conquest. Yet, characteristically, he portrayed the withdrawal as strategic rather than forced, and his reputation remained largely intact. His ability to maintain control after such a reverse demonstrated the remarkable hold he had over his followers. Undeterred by this rare setback, Attila invaded Italy the following year. Cities in the northern plains fell one after another as his horsemen swept down the peninsula. The Western Emperor fled from Ravenna to Rome, and it seemed nothing could stop the Hun advance on the Eternal City. Then, in a moment that would become legendary, Pope Leo I rode out to meet Attila near Mantua. What exactly transpired at this meeting remains mysterious. Christian tradition holds that the Pope, with divine assistance from the apparition of Saints Peter and Paul, persuaded Attila to spare Rome. More likely, Attila's army, already suffering from disease and supply shortages, was ready to return home with their substantial plunder. Whatever the truth, the Hun leader turned back, saving Rome from the fate that had befallen so many other cities. In 453 CE, at the height of his power and planning a new campaign against the Eastern Empire, Attila took a young bride named Ildiko in one of his many marriages. On his wedding night, after heavy drinking during the celebration, Attila suffered a nosebleed while lying on his back. Too intoxicated to notice, he choked to death on his own blood. An ignominious end for a warrior who had made the world tremble. According to tradition, to keep his burial place secret, a river was temporarily diverted, and Attila was buried in its bed along with immense treasures. The waters were then released to flow over the grave, and the slaves who performed the work were killed to ensure the location would remain forever unknown. Despite extensive archaeological efforts in Hungary, his grave has never been found. After Attila's death, his empire rapidly disintegrated. Without his forceful personality and strategic brilliance to hold them together, his sons quarreled over succession, and the subject peoples rebelled. Within a generation, the Hunnic Empire that had threatened both halves of the Roman world had vanished, absorbed into the confederations of other steppe peoples or scattered to the winds. Yet Attila's legacy endured in European consciousness as the archetypal barbarian destroyer, a symbol of the fragility of civilization when confronted with determined savagery. For centuries, his name would be invoked to personify the terror of invasion and conquest. What makes Attila's story so compelling is the contrast between his devastating impact on history and the relatively brief duration of his power. In less than 2 decades, he brought 2 Roman empires to their knees, accelerated the collapse of classical civilization in Western Europe, and permanently altered the ethnic composition of much of the continent through his campaigns of displacement. Few individuals with such transient empires have left such an indelible mark on history and the human imagination. His methods, combining overwhelming military force, psychological warfare, and the calculated use of terror, established a template for conquest that would be studied and emulated by military leaders for centuries to come. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the thunder of Hunnic hooves across the European plain, the glint of sunlight on countless arrowheads, and the cold, calculating gaze of a leader who understood that terror itself was a weapon. Picture the wooden palace on the Hungarian steppe, where Attila planned the humbling of emperors and the destruction of ancient cities, all while drinking from a simple wooden cup as befitted a warrior of the steppes. Consider how a world that had known a millennium of Roman civilization trembled before nomads who seemed to have emerged from nowhere, led by a man whose name would become a byword for destruction. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that even the mightiest empires can falter before determined adversaries, and that the most fearsome conquerors, for all their power, are still mortal men whose empires may not outlast them by even a generation. The story of Attila reminds us that the edifice of civilization, for all its grandeur, can be more fragile than we care to believe. A sobering thought to carry into your dreams. In the depths of a Moscow winter in 1530, within the fortress walls of the Kremlin, a child was born who would transform Russia through terror and blood. His name was Ivan Vasilievich, heir to the Grand Duchy of Moscow. For a fleeting moment, he was merely a prince in a realm still emerging from Mongol domination. But soon, the boy who witnessed unspeakable cruelty in his youth would become Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar and one of history's most paranoid and brutal autocrats, whose reign would oscillate between brilliant reform and horrifying madness. Ivan was born into a world of Byzantine splendor and savage court politics. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old, leaving the child as the nominal ruler of Muscovy. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent but died suddenly 5 years later, likely poisoned by rival nobles. The orphaned boy prince found himself at the mercy of the boyars, Russia's hereditary nobility, who fought viciously for control of the state while treating their young sovereign with contempt and cruelty. The young Ivan's childhood was a nightmare that would scar his psyche permanently. The boyars, who were supposed to protect and guide him instead, humiliated him daily, denying him food, clothing, and basic dignity while they plundered the royal treasury. He watched as his beloved nurse was torn from him and sent away. He witnessed brutal murders in the palace corridors. At night, drunken nobles would burst into his chambers, terrifying the boy who cowered in his bed. These experiences taught Ivan that power was the only protection against humiliation and death, a lesson he would apply with terrible thoroughness when his time came. At age 13, Ivan began to assert himself, ordering his first execution, commanding that the boyar Prince Andrei Schwisky be thrown to the palace dogs. This shocking act of violence from a child marked the beginning of his transformation from victim to victimizer. At 16, he had himself crowned not merely as Grand Duke, but as Tsar, Caesar, of all Russia, claiming a title that elevated him above any boyar and linked him to the glory of Rome and Byzantium. The coronation was a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence, establishing a new vision of absolute monarchy in Russia. Ivan's early reign showed tremendous promise. He married Anastasia Romanovna, who seemed to have a calming influence on his volatile temperament. He convened the First Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, reformed the legal code, and modernized the army. Most impressively, he broke the power of the Mongol successor states, conquering Kazan in 1552 and Astrakhan in 1556, opening the way to Siberia and transforming Moscow from a landlocked principality into a multi-ethnic empire. These victories were celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral, whose fantastic onion domes still dominate Red Square. Legend says Ivan had the architects blinded so they could never create anything as beautiful again. The turning point came in 1560, when Anastasia died, possibly from poison. Ivan's grief was volcanic, and he became convinced the boyars had murdered his beloved wife. His behavior, always prone to extremes, now careened into paranoia and sadism. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state ruled by his personal army of black-clad horsemen who carried a dog's head and a broom on their saddles, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. These oprichniki were given carte blanche to terrorize anyone suspected of disloyalty, creating a reign of terror that would consume thousands. What made Ivan truly terrible was his personal participation in torture and murder. Unlike rulers who merely ordered atrocities, Ivan often supervised or carried out tortures himself, displaying a creative sadism that shocked even his brutal age. He had people skinned alive, boiled in cauldrons, or impaled on stakes. He would alternate between sessions of torture and fervent prayer, believing himself God's appointed scourge. The city of Novgorod, suspected of treason, was subjected to a 5-week orgy of violence in 1570. Ivan's oprichniki systematically drowned, burned, or hacked to death perhaps 15,000 of the city's inhabitants, while the Tsar watched, occasionally joining in the slaughter. Ivan's madness reached its apex in 1581 when, in a fit of rage, he struck his son and heir, also named Ivan, with his iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal, and the prince died in his father's arms 3 days later. The Tsar's grief was genuine and overwhelming. He had killed his capable heir, leaving only his feeble son Fyodor to succeed him. This act of filicide haunted Ivan's remaining years, as he wandered his palace at night, howling with remorse. When Ivan died in 1584, possibly from mercury poisoning due to medical treatment for his various ailments, Russia was exhausted from his reign. He left behind a nation expanded territorially but devastated internally. The oprichnina had killed thousands and destroyed entire regions. His paranoid execution of competent nobles had decimated Russia's leadership class. Within a decade of his death, the country would collapse into the time of troubles, a period of civil war and foreign invasion that nearly destroyed the Russian state. Yet Ivan also left a complex legacy of territorial expansion, administrative reform, and the establishment of Russian autocracy that would influence his successors for centuries. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the snow-covered towers of the Kremlin, where a damaged child grew into a damaged man who damaged an entire nation. Picture the black-clad oprichniki riding through Russian towns, bringing terror in the name of their terrible Tsar. Consider how childhood trauma can echo through history when its victim gains unlimited power, transforming personal pain into public catastrophe. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that even the mightiest rulers are shaped by their earliest experiences, and that the abused child who gains absolute power may become the most dangerous ruler of all. In the war-torn landscape of ancient China in 259 BCE, in the state of Qin, a child was born who would unite a fractured land through unprecedented brutality. His name was Yingzheng, born to a minor prince during China's chaotic warring states period. For a fleeting moment, he was merely a hostage prince, his life hanging by a thread in a world of constant warfare. But soon, the boy who survived assassination attempts and political intrigue would become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, a ruler whose quest for immortality and absolute control would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and nearly erase China's intellectual heritage. Yingzheng's birth was surrounded by scandal and danger. His father was a hostage in the enemy state of Zhao, and rumors persisted that his true father was actually a wealthy merchant. When he was just 3, he and his mother barely escaped execution when Zhao discovered his father had fled. These early years of persecution and uncertainty forged a character of iron determination mixed with deep paranoia. When his father became king of Qin, young Yingzheng returned to a court where his legitimacy was questioned and assassins lurked in every shadow. At age 13, Yingzheng ascended to the throne of Qin, though real power remained with the regent and his mother's lover, Lao Ai. The young king bided his time, learning the arts of statecraft and war while navigating treacherous court politics. When he discovered that Lao Ai was plotting against him and had fathered 2 children with his mother, Yingzheng struck with ruthless efficiency. Lao Ai was torn apart by horses, his entire clan exterminated, and the 2 children were killed. His mother was spared, but exiled. At 22, he had eliminated all rivals and taken direct control of the most militarily powerful of the 7 warring states. What followed was a campaign of conquest unprecedented in Chinese history. Using superior military technology, including mass-produced bronze weapons and crossbows, along with the ruthless philosophy of legalism that prioritized state power over human life, Qin's armies swept across China. Enemy states fell one by one. Han in 230 BCE, Zhao in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221 BCE. The methods were brutal. Entire cities were razed, their populations enslaved or massacred. When the city of Changping surrendered, Qin forces buried alive an estimated 400,000 prisoners of war. The unification came at a cost of perhaps 1 million lives. In 221 BCE, With all of China under his control, Yingzheng proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He standardized currency, weights, measures, and even the width of cart axles across his empire. He built roads and canals that connected distant provinces. Most importantly, he standardized the Chinese script, creating a unified writing system that would endure for millennia. But these achievements came through tyrannical methods. He divided the empire into 36 commanderies, each ruled by officials appointed by and answerable only to him. He confiscated all weapons from the populace, melting them down into statues. He moved 120,000 of the wealthiest families to his capital where they could be watched. What made Qin Shi Huang particularly reviled by later generations was his assault on Chinese intellectual and cultural life. Advised by his chancellor Li Si, he decided that diverse philosophies and historical records threatened his absolute rule. In 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of all books except those on medicine, agriculture, and divination. Philosophical works, poetry, and histories that didn't glorify Qin were to be destroyed. When scholars protested, he had 460 of them buried alive as a warning to others. This cultural catastrophe destroyed much of China's written heritage, creating gaps in historical knowledge that persist to this day. The emperor's construction projects were as grandiose as they were deadly. He connected and extended existing fortifications to create what would become the Great Wall of China, conscripting hundreds of thousands of workers who labored under horrific conditions. So many died that the wall was said to be built on bones. He constructed a massive tomb complex near modern-day Xi'an, protected by the famous terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers meant to guard him in the afterlife. The tomb itself, which has never been fully excavated due to concerns about mercury poisoning, allegedly contains rivers of mercury and a ceiling studded with pearls to represent the night sky. Tens of thousands of workers died creating this monument to one man's fear of death. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality consumed his later years. He sent expeditions to find the elixir of life, including one led by Shu Fu with 3,000 young men and women who never returned, possibly founding a colony in Japan rather than face the emperor's wrath at their failure. He consumed mercury pills prescribed by alchemists, likely hastening his death. His paranoia reached pathological levels. He never slept in the same room twice, had multiple identical palaces built, and traveled in secret. When a meteorite fell inscribed with words predicting his death and the division of his empire, he had everyone in the vicinity executed. The emperor died in 210 BCE at age 49, likely from mercury poisoning while on one of his inspection tours. His chief eunuch Zhao Gao and Chancellor Li Si concealed his death, keeping his corpse in a sealed carriage surrounded by rotting fish to mask the smell of decay. They forged orders in his name, forcing his capable eldest son to commit suicide and installing a weak younger son as second emperor. Within 4 years, the Qin dynasty collapsed in widespread rebellion. The harshness of Qin rule had created such hatred that rebels competed to desecrate Qin Shi Huang's tomb and slaughter anyone connected to his regime. Yet Qin Shi Huang's legacy endures in contradictory ways. He is reviled in Chinese culture as a symbol of tyranny, the cautionary tale of absolute power corrupting absolutely. But modern China also owes its existence to his ruthless unification. The centralized state he created, the standardized culture he imposed, and even the name China itself, derived from Qin, are his lasting monuments. Mao Zedong, another unifier through brutality, praised him, saying, "He buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000 scholars alive." Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the vast construction sites of ancient China where hundreds of thousands labored and died to satisfy one man's grandiose visions. Picture the smoke rising from burning books, centuries of wisdom reduced to ash, while scholars who protested were silenced forever beneath the earth. Consider how the quest for unity and immortality can transform a ruler into a destroyer of the very civilization he claims to protect. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that those who try to control all of history, past, present, and future, often end up being controlled by their own mortality, leaving behind monuments built on suffering and a name that echoes through time as a warning. In the dusty oasis city of Kesh in 1336, in what is now Uzbekistan, a child was born into minor nobility who would one day tower over pyramids of human skulls. His name was Timur, meaning iron in his native Turkic tongue. For a fleeting moment, he was merely the son of a minor tribal chief, lame in his right leg from a childhood injury. But soon, the ambitious warrior would style himself as the heir to Genghis Khan and carve out an empire through systematic terror, becoming Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, whose campaigns would claim the lives of 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. Timur was born into the Balas tribe, Mongol in origin, but thoroughly Turkified and Islamic in culture. His early life was shaped by the chaos following the collapse of the Mongol Empire in Central Asia. Unlike Genghis Khan, he was not born to rule, but had to claw his way to power through cunning and brutality. As a young man, he started as a sheep rustler and bandit, gathering followers through a combination of charisma, generosity to allies, and mercilessness to enemies. His lameness, caused by arrow wounds sustained in his youth, never hindered his ability to command or his skill in battle. He simply had himself carried to the fighting when he could not ride. The young Timur apprenticed himself in the art of power by serving, betraying, and eventually supplanting a series of more powerful warlords. He married Saray Mulk Khanum, a princess descended from Genghis Khan, which allowed him to claim legitimacy as a restorer of the Mongol Empire, though he could never take the title of Khan himself due to his non-Genghisid blood. By 1370, through a masterful combination of military victories, strategic marriages, and timely assassinations, he had made himself master of Transoxiana with his capital at Samarkand. From this base, he would launch campaigns of conquest that would stretch from Delhi to Damascus, from Moscow to the Mediterranean. What set Tamerlane apart from other conquerors was his systematic use of terror as a tool of empire building. He didn't merely defeat enemies, he sought to traumatize entire regions into submission. After capturing a city that had resisted him, he would order his soldiers to bring a specified number of heads, sometimes 2 per soldier, sometimes more. These would be piled into pyramids outside the city walls, monuments to the price of defiance. At Isfahan in 1387, he erected a pyramid of 70,000 skulls. At Delhi in 1398, he built minarets from 90,000 heads. At Baghdad in 1401, he constructed 120 pyramids from the heads of its inhabitants. These grotesque monuments served as warnings that would echo across continents. Tamerlane's military genius was undeniable. He adapted Mongol cavalry tactics to the age of gunpowder, incorporating primitive artillery and firearms into his forces. He used sophisticated intelligence networks, employed engineers from across his empire, and showed remarkable flexibility in adopting whatever tactics suited the terrain and enemy. His armies could move with stunning speed, appearing where least expected. But it was his calculated cruelty that made resistance crumble. Cities that surrendered immediately might be spared. Those that resisted faced annihilation. The entire population of resisting cities, men, women, children, even animals, would be systematically slaughtered, with soldiers required to show proof of their kills. The scope of Tamerlane's destruction defies comprehension. In 1383, he punished a revolt in Isfahan by killing an estimated 200,000 people. When Baghdad resisted in 1401, he ordered each soldier to bring 2 heads. The summer heat and piled corpses created a plague that killed thousands more. In India, his passage left entire regions depopulated. He destroyed the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, turning fertile lands into deserts that wouldn't recover for centuries. Ancient cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Delhi were reduced to ruins. He took particular pleasure in destroying the cultural achievements of civilizations, except when he could cart them back to beautify Samarkand. Yet Tamerlane saw himself not as a destroyer, but as the sword of Islam, purifying the faith and punishing the wicked. He could quote the Quran from memory and surrounded himself with Islamic scholars. Before each campaign, he would seek religious justification for his actions. Christian kingdoms, Hindu rulers, and even fellow Muslims who didn't meet his standards of orthodoxy faced his wrath. The contradiction between his professed piety and his monstrous actions created a cognitive dissonance he resolved by claiming divine sanction for every atrocity. After destroying Damascus, he had a theological debate with Ibn Khaldun, the great historian, showing he was no mere brutal warlord, but an intellectually sophisticated monster. His campaigns reached their crescendo with the invasion of India in 1398. Crossing the Hindu Kush, he carved a path of destruction through the subcontinent. At Delhi, fearing his soldiers might show mercy to the 100,000 Hindu prisoners taken during the campaign, he ordered them all executed before the battle. The city itself was subjected to systematic pillage and massacre. The Tughlaq dynasty never recovered from the blow. Tamerlane returned to Samarkand with wagon loads of treasure and thousands of captured artisans who would beautify his capital, leaving behind a traumatized subcontinent where his name would become a byword for catastrophe. Even near the end of his life, Tamerlane's ambition remained unbounded. At 68, he planned the conquest of China, seeing himself as destined to unite the entire Mongol Empire under his rule. In the winter of 1404, despite warnings from his advisors about his health and the season, he marched his army eastward. But the iron constitution that had survived decades of campaigning finally failed. He fell ill and died in February 1405 in the city of Otrar, his dreams of world conquest unfulfilled. His body was returned to Samarkand and interred in a jade tomb with the inscription, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." His empire, built on terror rather than institutions, fragmented quickly among his descendants. Within a generation, the Timurid Empire had shrunk to parts of Central Asia and Persia, but his legacy of destruction endured far longer than his political achievements. Regions he had devastated took centuries to recover their populations and prosperity. The psychological trauma of his campaigns entered the folklore of a dozen cultures. Paradoxically, his descendants became renowned patrons of art and learning. His great-great-grandson Babur would found the Mughal Empire in India, creating a civilization of remarkable cultural achievement from the ashes of Tamerlane's devastation. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the steppes of Central Asia where a lame boy dreamed of empire, and the smoking ruins of great cities where those dreams became nightmares for millions. Picture the pyramids of skulls bleaching in the sun, monuments to one man's belief that terror could forge an empire. Consider how military genius combined with utter disregard for human life can create a legacy that makes even hardened historians struggle to comprehend the scale of suffering. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that some conquerors build empires to last, while others seem intent only on proving that human cruelty has no limits, leaving behind nothing but ruins, memories of terror, and the bones of the innocent. In a modest village in French colonial Cambodia in 1925, a child was born who would one day orchestrate one of history's most horrific genocides. His name was Saloth Sar, born to a prosperous farming family with connections to the royal court. For a fleeting moment, he was just another privileged youth sent to Paris to study on government scholarship. But soon, the failed engineering student would transform himself into Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge, whose utopian vision would turn Cambodia into a vast concentration camp where a quarter of the population would perish in less than 4 years. Saloth Sar grew up in a Cambodia that was a French protectorate, his early life marked by privilege rather than hardship. His family owned land, his sister was a royal concubine, and his brother worked at the palace. As a young man, he was sent to Paris in 1949 to study radio electronics, joining many other young Cambodians acquiring Western education. But in the cafes of the Latin Quarter, he discovered not engineering but Marxism, joining the French Communist Party and absorbing ideas about class struggle and revolutionary transformation that he would later distort into something unrecognizably monstrous. The young Saloth Sar was, by all accounts, unremarkable, a mediocre student who failed his exams and lost his scholarship, forcing him to return to Cambodia in 1953. But beneath his mild manner and soft-spoken demeanor lay a growing radicalization. He became a teacher in Phnom Penh while secretly organizing communist cells. As he rose through the ranks of Cambodia's communist movement, he adopted the nom de guerre Pol Pot and developed an ideology that went beyond conventional Marxism. He envisioned returning Cambodia to an agrarian utopia, purified of foreign influence, urban corruption, and intellectual contamination, a vision that would require the elimination of anyone connected to the modern world. The path to power was long and bloody. Throughout the 1960s, Pol Pot built his movement in the jungle, recruiting peasants and disaffected youth while government forces hunted them. The Vietnam War's spillover into Cambodia, including massive American bombing campaigns, created chaos that the Khmer Rouge exploited. By presenting themselves as nationalists fighting foreign intervention and government corruption, they gained support. On April 17, 1975, after years of civil war, Khmer Rouge forces marched into Phnom Penh. Residents initially celebrated, believing the war was over. They had no idea they were cheering their own executioners. Within hours of victory, the true horror began. Pol Pot ordered the complete evacuation of Phnom Penh and all other cities. Over 2 million people were forced at gunpoint to march into the countryside. The sick were pushed from hospital beds, families were separated, and anyone who resisted was shot. Thousands died on these death marches from exhaustion, starvation, and execution. The Khmer Rouge told people the evacuation was temporary, necessary to avoid American bombing. In reality, it was the beginning of Pol Pot's plan to transform Cambodia into his twisted vision of an agrarian communist utopia by destroying urban civilization entirely. What followed was autogenocide, a nation systematically murdering its own people. Pol Pot declared it was Year Zero. Cambodia would start history anew. Money was abolished, private property eliminated, religion banned. Books were burned, schools turned into prisons, temples destroyed, families were separated, with children encouraged to inform on their parents. The entire population was forced into agricultural communes where they worked from dawn to dusk on starvation rations. But it was the killing that defined the regime. Anyone connected to the old society, teachers, doctors, engineers, anyone who wore glasses, seen as a sign of literacy, anyone who spoke a foreign language, was marked for death. The methods of murder were deliberately primitive to save bullets. Victims were beaten to death with iron bars, hose, and wooden clubs. Babies were swung against trees. People were buried alive or had their throats cut with palm fronds. The infamous S-21 prison in Phnom Penh, a former school, processed thousands of victims, photographing each one before torture and execution. Across the country, killing fields filled with bodies. At Choeung Ek, one of hundreds of such sites, nearly 9,000 bodies were later exhumed from mass graves. The Khmer Rouge kept meticulous records of their atrocities, documenting their own crimes with bureaucratic efficiency. Pol Pot's paranoia drove the killing machine to ever greater extremes. Convinced that Vietnamese agents and CIA spies had infiltrated his revolution, he ordered purge after purge. Entire regions were depopulated on suspicion of disloyalty. Even veteran Khmer Rouge cadres were tortured into confessing elaborate plots before being executed. The Eastern Zone, suspected of insufficient revolutionary fervor, saw hundreds of thousands massacred. Khmer Rouge soldiers who showed any hesitation in killing were themselves killed. The revolution devoured its own children as Pol Pot retreated further into isolation, directing the slaughter from hidden jungle headquarters. The regime's agricultural policies were as deadly as its executions. Pol Pot's belief that revolutionary will could overcome material reality led to impossible production quotas. Rice harvests were seized to export for weapons, leaving farmers to starve. Traditional farming knowledge was rejected as reactionary, replaced with disastrous experiments. Irrigation projects using slave labor destroyed as much farmland as they created. Starvation became widespread, with people reduced to eating bark and grass. Families watched their children die of hunger while surrounded by rice fields they had planted, but were forbidden to harvest. The combination of execution, starvation, and disease claimed between 1.5 and 2 million lives, at least a quarter of Cambodia's population. The end came from an unexpected source. In 1977, Pol Pot's paranoid nationalism led him to attack Vietnam, massacring Vietnamese civilians in border regions. Vietnam, battle-hardened from decades of war, responded with a full invasion in December 1978. The Khmer Rouge army, weakened by purges and facing a population that hated them, collapsed quickly. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh, and Pol Pot fled to the Thai border. The discovery of S-21's archives and the killing fields revealed to the world the full extent of the horror. Survivors emerged from hiding, skeletal and traumatized, to search for family members they would never find. Incredibly, Pol Pot escaped justice for nearly 2 decades. Protected by Cold War politics, China and the United States opposed the Vietnamese occupation. The Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's UN seat until 1991. Pol Pot continued to lead the movement from jungle bases, still claiming his revolution had been necessary and justified. Only in 1997, as his movement finally disintegrated, was he arrested by his own forces. He died on April 15, 1998, apparently of heart failure, though many suspected suicide or murder. He never faced trial for his crimes, going to his grave unrepentant. What makes Pol Pot's crimes particularly chilling was their ideological nature. This wasn't ancient barbarism or wartime excess, but a calculated attempt to remake human society through mass murder in the late 20th century. The educated, soft-spoken teacher had created a system of death more thorough than the Nazi Holocaust in its attempt to destroy its own nation's culture and people. His regime showed how utopian ideology, combined with absolute power and paranoid leadership, could transform an entire country into a death camp. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the silent fields of Cambodia where bones still surface after monsoon rains, monuments to an experiment in social engineering that cost 2 million lives. Picture the mountains of skulls at memorial sites, each one representing a teacher, a parent, a child who died because someone decided their existence was incompatible with revolutionary purity. Consider how the 20th century's tools of organization and control could be turned to genocide by a man who never raised his own hand in violence but orchestrated suffering on an industrial scale. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who believe most fervently in their vision of paradise, willing to wade through oceans of blood to reach their imagined utopia. As we reach the end of our journey through history's shadows, you might feel the weight of these terrible tales pressing upon your consciousness. We have walked through centuries of cruelty, witnessed the depths of human depravity, and seen how power can corrupt souls beyond recognition. From ancient tyrants to modern monsters, from Vlad's forests of the impaled to Pol Pot's killing fields, we have traced the bloody footprints of those who chose darkness over light. But remember, dear dreamer, that these stories serve a purpose beyond mere horror. They stand as sentinels in the corridors of time, warning us of the paths we must never take. For every tyrant who rose to power, there were countless ordinary people who resisted, who chose compassion over cruelty, who preserved the flame of humanity even in history's darkest nights. The very fact that we remember these rulers as evil, that their names invoke revulsion rather than admiration, shows that the human conscience, though sometimes overwhelmed, is never entirely extinguished. As you drift now toward peaceful slumber, let these tales not trouble your dreams, but instead remind you of the preciousness of kindness, the power of mercy, and the importance of standing guard against the darkness that can grow in any human heart. History's greatest lesson is not that evil is powerful, but that it is ultimately self-defeating. Every tyrant we have discussed tonight fell. Their empires crumbled, their very names became curses. What endures is not their cruelty, but humanity's capacity to survive, to rebuild, and to choose a better path. So close your eyes now, dear dreamer, and let the gentle rhythm of your breathing carry you away from these shadows. Tomorrow's sun will rise on a world where you can choose to be a force for good, where small acts of kindness can stand as rebellion against history's darkness. Let your dreams be filled not with the nightmares we have shared, but with visions of the world as it could be, a world where power serves justice, where strength protects the vulnerable, and where the lessons of the past guide us toward a more compassionate future. Sleep now, wrapped in the comfort of your bed, safe in the knowledge that while darkness has its hour, it is always followed by the dawn. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your awakening bring renewed faith in humanity's capacity for good. For in the end, it is not the tyrants who define us, but our ability to learn from their failures and choose a different way. Sweet dreams, dear traveler through time. The night is passing, and tomorrow awaits with all its possibilities for light, love, and hope.